Hi everyone, this is Amy Johnson Crow, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. This week we are going to tackle source citations. They're not as hard as you think. Now, if the thought of creating a good source citation sends chills down your spine and it gives you flashbacks to your high school English class where you were graded on the accuracy and the format of all those footnotes and endnotes that you had to create, for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about how to create a good source citation without having all the anxiety. And I don't know what it is about citations that send some people it just makes them absolutely crazy. So that's what we're going to talk about. Source citations, they're not as hard as you think. So what we're going to cover in the next few minutes: why you should even bother with source citations. And for a lot of people, that's a really good question. Why should you bother with them? We're also going to talk about the building blocks of a good citation. What we're not going to cover is how to enter them in your genealogy software. So if you're using Family Tree Maker and you have specific questions on how to enter source citations in Family Tree Maker, I would advise you to go to the Ancestry.com YouTube channel. There are all sorts of videos on the Ancestry.com YouTube channel on how to enter source citations into Family Tree Maker. We're also not going to cover how to format citations. What should be in quotes and what should be italicized and what needs a comma and what should have a semicolon. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what really constitutes a good source citation, getting those elements in there, getting those building blocks. Formatting, you can take care of that later. It's really important to have a good handle on what needs to go into that citation. I have heard this argument against good citations, I can't tell you how many times. So often when the conversation goes around to, having good citations for our genealogy, someone will say, "Oh, I'm not going to publish my genealogy, so I don't need to bother with source citations." Or maybe they'll qualify it as, "I don't need to bother with extensive source citations or really good source citations." But the argument seems to be that, well, if I'm not going to publish, then I don't need to bother with this. Well, there are a few things I would encourage you to think about, even if you're not going to publish your genealogy. Good source citations will help you locate that source again later. There will almost inevitably be a time when you will need to review that source because you'll come across something that seems to contradict what you already have. So you need to be able to know, well, where did I find this information to begin with? So you need to be able to go back to that source and review it again. And what happens if you lose that copy or that digital file that you were working from? If you have a good source citation, then you still know exactly where you found that information. So a good source citation will help you locate that source again later. A good source citation will also give you ideas for further research. So as you're going through the notes and conclusions that you've come up with, a good source citation might make you think, well, hey, if I found this family in this particular source, maybe I'll find this other family in the same source. These families are similar. I really should probably look for this other family in this source as well. You're not going to have those leads if you don't have a good source citation. And a good source citation will help you evaluate what you have, because not all sources are created equal. So being able to just look at a glance will help you tell whether or not, it'll help you set how confident you are in the facts that you are stating by being able to tell exactly where that information came from. Excuse me. So let's take a look at the difference between a citation and a good citation. Let's say that you have the fact that Edward Smith died the 1st of April, 1909. A citation might just say, tombstone. Well, that kind of begs the question, did you see the tombstone in person? Did you view a photo of it on a website? Pardon me. Did you see a transcription of the tombstone on a website, in a book of cemetery readings? What exactly does that mean that the source was tombstone? A good citation for that same fact, Edward Smith, who died the 1st of April 1909, might be Cemeteries of Clear Creek Township, Fairfield County, Ohio, and it gives the publication information and an exact page. So I can tell at a glance that this death information is coming from this book, which is a book of cemetery readings. I see exactly who published it, and I see when it was published. So that's the difference between a citation and a good citation. That good citation tells me exactly what it was I looked at. Which brings us to the number one rule of source citations. Cite what you saw. Don't make it sound like you looked at the tombstone when you actually read the data in a book or on a website. Okay, so cite exactly what it was that you saw. That's our number one rule of source citations. Be clear about what it was that you used. Now, the elements of a good source citation. They tell you enough to point you or someone else to exactly the source that you used. And they also tell you enough to help you evaluate it as a source. So looking at some more specific things that a good source citation contains. A good source citation will have some sort of indication of the author or the creator of that information. A title, it could be a book title, it could be the title of a database. Publishing information, whether it's a book or whether it's a website. A specific reference, such as a page number, a file number, a certificate number. Something that will lead you to that specific reference that you used in what is probably a much larger collection. The location, if it isn't a common source. So let's say that your source is a county history and there are thousands of copies of this county history. You may not need to note the location of that county history since you can find it in numerous places. But if it's something that's rare, you might want to note it. You might want to note exactly where you found that reference. And a rule of thumb when you're putting information into a source citation, if in doubt, go ahead and include it. It's better to have too much information in your citations than it is to have too little. So if in doubt, go ahead and include it. Now, books are pretty easy. The great thing about books is that they often give you a nice title page, or at least the cover, where it will have the title of the book and publishing information. So if I'm using this particular book, I'll want to make sure that I note the title, A Biographical History of Fairfield and Perry Counties, Ohio. There's no author for this book, but I do have publishing information. So I can note that it was published by S.J. Clark Publishing from New York in 1902. And I want to make sure that I include that year so I can evaluate later any information that I find in it. If this book is published in 1902, I may not give quite the weight to information about someone who was serving in the Revolutionary War, because they obviously didn't give that information for a book that was published in 1902. So I want to make sure that I include that year to help me evaluate information later. So books are pretty straightforward when it comes to good source citations. But a few things to remember. Make sure that you note the publishing information, the publisher, the year. Make a note if it's a revised edition. There are going to be changes between a first edition, a second edition, third edition. Facts might have changed, sections might have been rewritten, page numbers certainly change. So if you're using, say, a third edition of a book, make sure that you note that. And if it's a rare book, note where you found it. If it's a book that there were only a few copies ever published, note what library or archive or website you found that book, because it's not going to be as easy to find later. On a similar vein, family Bibles. So family Bibles, just like other books, you will want to include the title, in this case, the Holy Bible containing the Old and New Testaments. Publishing info is very important on family Bibles, especially the year. Because if I have a Bible like this one that's published in 1854, but there are births and marriages from the 1700s recorded in it, then I know that those events weren't recorded at the time that they occurred. If I see a birth that's recorded from 1780, I know that it wasn't recorded at that time because this Bible wasn't published until 1854. So it's very important to note the year that a family Bible was published. And family Bibles, just like other rare books, you will want to note where you found it. So you might want to make a note such as, in the possession of John Smith, 123 Maple Street, Chicago, Illinois, as of the 26th of June, 2013. So it will help you and others locate that Bible later. Census records. Great for genealogical information, and they're pretty easy to cite. But a lot of times we will leave out a lot of information that would make a really good source citation. So often we'll see source citations that will just say 1940 census. Well, there are a lot of entries in the 1940 census. A good source citation will point us to the exact one. So think about including the name of the head of household, the census year, the type of census. There are different types of censuses. The location, where was this household located? The household information, and where did you find this census record? So let's take a look at an example. Recently, I looked up the Flying Wallendas in the 1940 census. I was inspired by a recent high wire act that went across the Grand Canyon. I still don't know how he did that. But I was curious and I wanted to find the Wallenda family in the 1940 census. And here's a portion of the census entry. Now, if I was going to construct a source citation for this household, and everything you see here, all of these people are in one household, here are the elements that I would like to include. That it's the Carl Wallenda household, it's the 1940 U.S. Census, it was part of the population schedule, This household was in Sarasota County, Florida. They were in Enumeration District 58-7A on sheet 8B, household 220, and I downloaded this image from archives.com. So this tells me exactly what I looked at and will help me find this exact record later if I need to. It has all of the information I need. Now, I don't think that there were too many Carl Walendas in the 1940 US Census, but let's say that you're researching somebody where there are lots of people with that name. Say you're looking for John Smith or Elizabeth Miller. There are going to be hundreds, if not thousands of them. So having this detailed information will definitely help you later when you want to go back and look at that exact census. So what about websites and databases when we're using those? Similar to a book or any other type of information that we're using, get a title, both the title of the database and the title of the website. Get a description if that title of the database doesn't really tell you what it is. Get the URL, that www dot, get that URL in there, again, to help you find it later. And there's a lot of debate over whether or not you need the date that you actually looked at the record. I go ahead and include it in mine, if for no other reason than it helps me to place where I found that record, when I found it, and what I knew at the time when I found it. So go ahead and include the date. Again, you'll see debate going back and forth on whether or not you really need it. I go by the axiom that if in doubt, go ahead and include it. So let's say that you've downloaded this particular death certificate. What would be a good citation for it? Well, what we've downloaded was the John Smith death certificate. And you might want to go ahead and also include the certificate number here, the 63897, the certificate number. We downloaded it from archives.com. And note that in this case, that's both the name of the website and the URL where we found it. The name of the database within archives.com was Tennessee State Death Records. And again, I can note that I downloaded this image the 25th of June, 2013. So we have an exact record. We're referencing the exact record. We're saying where we found it. We're giving information about the database or the collection that this record was in, and an idea of when we viewed it or when we downloaded it. So that's all well and good for images, but what about records like this, where it's just the data? We don't have the image of the actual record. Well, you can still do something very similar. In this case, you could say James E. Miller death record, found it at archives.com, that it was part of the Texas Death Records collection. And I can note that I viewed this data the 25th of June, 2013. And you might also want to note in your citation that no image was available, just to make it clear that you were looking at something that wasn't the actual certificate. It was an index or an abstract. So we're still getting that good information. I can still use this to evaluate the data that I have, and it gives me information so I can find this record easily later. So good source citations. They lead you back to exactly what you used. They will accurately reflect what you used. And they will help you evaluate what you found. Think of a good source citation as being the who, what, and where of the data that you found. Where did you find that fact? A good source citation will answer the who, the what, and the where of that data. And good source citations get easier the more you create them. At first, if you're not in the habit of creating really good source citations, it can be a little difficult to get into the habit. It can seem very cumbersome. But trust me, they get a lot easier the more you create them because you start to get a feel for what type of information you need to include. Just remember to relax, don't stress about the formatting. You can always change formatting later. What is much harder to do is go back and get information that's missing. Say you didn't record when that family Bible was published. Well, then you have to go back and find that family Bible and get that information. Just gather the information. That's the important thing. Worry about the formatting later. Just get that good information to tell you the who, the what, and the where of that source that you're using. Next week on the archives.com live stream, we are going to talk about Patriots of Color, African Americans in the Revolutionary War. That will be next Wednesday, July the 3rd, at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Certainly hope you can join us for that. In the meantime, please stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog, liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, or going back and viewing previous live streams on our YouTube channel. All of our previous live streams are available there. So if you are watching this live stream live, check out the YouTube channel and you can see what we've done in previous weeks. If you happen to be watching this later on YouTube, stop by on Wednesdays and check out our live streams. Join us in the chat room. And speaking of the chat room, I will be available to answer some questions for a little bit after this. So until next week, this is Amy Johnson Crow wishing you happy researching.